Imagine waking up one morning, turning on your computer, and being told you can no longer protect your own data. Not because you did anything wrong, not because your software is broken, but because a trillion-dollar corporation silently pulled the plug on the developer keeping your encryption alive, without a single warning, without an explanation, and with zero ability to appeal. That is exactly what just happened to millions of Windows users around the world, and if you use VeraCrypt or WireGuard, this story could directly affect whether your computer even boots up by the end of this month. Munir Adrasi is the developer behind VeraCrypt, one of the most trusted open-source disk encryption tools on the planet. For years, he has quietly maintained the software that protects the private files, full system drives, and sensitive data of millions of people, journalists, activists, enterprises, and everyday users who simply want control over their own information. In January 2026, he attempted to sign a new Windows driver update just as he had done dozens of times before. But this time, he was met with a wall. Microsoft had terminated his developer account without any notice whatsoever. No email, no warning banner, no phone call, no explanation. Just a cold automated message informing him that his organization did not meet verification requirements and that no appeal was possible. He spent the next 3 months trying to reach a human being at Microsoft. He tried every support channel available. Every single path led to the same dead end. Automated bots, scripted replies, and a system architecturally designed to reject rather than resolve. When he finally went public on SourceForge in late March 2026 and described what had happened, the tech community erupted. And what people discovered as they dug deeper was that this was not an isolated case of one developer falling through the cracks. Like and subscribe, because what we are about to unpack is something every single Windows user needs to fully understand. Jason Donenfeld is the creator of WireGuard, a VPN protocol so efficient and so mathematically elegant that it has become the backbone of some of the most popular commercial VPN services operating today: Mullvad, ProtonVPN, Tailscale, and dozens of others. When you use those services, WireGuard is the engine running underneath. Hundreds of millions of people depend on it every single day without knowing its name. In late March 2026, Donenfeld went to certify a new kernel driver update for WireGuard on Windows, and he found the exact same wall Adrasi had found. His account showed that words access restricted. He eventually tracked down an appeals process buried inside Microsoft's documentation, but it carried a 60-day response window. 60 days for security infrastructure that underpins the private internet connections of hundreds of millions of people. To understand why this situation is so dangerous, you need to understand how Windows driver signing actually works. When software needs to operate at the kernel level, the deepest, most privileged layer of an operating system, it must be cryptographically signed by a verified developer. This is a legitimate and important security mechanism. Microsoft requires all kernel mode drivers to carry a valid digital signature from a verified account enrolled in the Windows hardware program. Without that signature, Windows 10 and Windows 11 will simply refuse to load the driver. The software does not run. For most applications, this would be an inconvenience. You cannot get updates, and users are stuck on an older version. But for software like VeraCrypt, which operates before the operating system, even fully loads, the consequences are far more severe. An expired or revoked signature does not just mean you cannot push an update. It means your computer may not turn on at all. This brings us to the single most alarming detail in this entire story. And if you remember nothing else, remember this. VeraCrypt's Windows bootloader is signed under a Microsoft Certificate Authority known as the Microsoft Corporation UEFI CA 2011. That certificate authority is being revoked after July 2026. The moment Microsoft pulls that certificate authority, any Windows machine running VeraCrypt full disk encryption that has not been updated to use a new signature will be unable to boot. The startup screen will appear, the bootloader will fail to load, and the user will be sitting in front of a machine that will not start and encrypted files they cannot reach. There's no shortcut, there's no workaround that does not require technical recovery procedures. Most users would never know to attempt. And to sign a new VeraCrypt bootloader under the replacement certificate authority, Adrasi needs the very developer account that Microsoft has terminated. Like and subscribe, because this deadline is measured in weeks, and the majority of users at risk have no idea it even exists. The numbers make the stakes concrete. The latest Windows installer for VeraCrypt recorded nearly 1 million downloads since its May 2025 release alone. Analysts estimate the total number of active devices running VeraCrypt for full disk encryption globally at somewhere between 5 and 10 million machines. These are not casual users. People who go through the process of enabling full disk encryption with VeraCrypt are doing so deliberately and for serious reasons. They are protecting healthcare records, financial documents, legal communications, journalistic sources, classified research, and personal data that, if exposed, could cause devastating real-world harm. The idea that all of those encrypted drives could become permanently inaccessible because of a silent account termination by a corporation is not a hypothetical risk. It is a deadline moving toward them like a freight train. To understand why Microsoft took this action, you need to go back to December 2022. Microsoft confirmed that year that multiple cybercriminal groups had successfully abused its Windows hardware developer program to get malware digitally signed by Microsoft itself. Security researchers at SentinelOne, Mandiant, and Sophos had been investigating suspicious activity on compromised networks and discovered something alarming. Threat actors had obtained legitimate developer accounts in the Microsoft Partner Center and used them to submit malicious kernel mode drivers for Microsoft's attestation signing process. Microsoft's system reviewed the submissions and signed them. Those drivers now carried valid Microsoft digital signatures, which meant that antivirus tools, endpoint detection software, and every security product that implicitly trusted Microsoft-signed code had no reason to flag them. The malware slipped past every guardian. The signed malicious drivers were then deployed in ransomware operations across multiple industries. The Cuba ransomware group was among those using this technique, deploying the signed drivers to terminate endpoint protection software before delivering their ransomware payloads. Other threat actors were found using the same signed toolkit against telecommunications companies, healthcare providers, financial firms, and managed security service providers. The damage was real, and the breach of trust was serious. Microsoft had, without intending to, become an unwilling co-signer of malware. When the company came under enormous pressure to explain itself and prevent recurrence, tightening the verification process for developer accounts was the logical response. Microsoft's fix was to implement mandatory re-verification for all partners enrolled in the Windows hardware program who had not completed identity verification since April 2024. The new requirement kicked in on October 16, 2025, giving all affected partners a 30-day window to re-verify their identity using a government-issued ID. That ID had to match the name of the primary contact listed on the Partner Center account. Miss the deadline or fail verification for any reason, and the account would be suspended with no further submissions allowed. In theory, this is a reasonable security improvement. In practice, the execution of this policy became one of the most damaging self-inflicted wounds Microsoft has caused in the open source ecosystem in years. Microsoft's EUP for Windows and devices, Pavan Davuluri, later stated publicly that the company had sent emails, displayed banners in the Partner Center portal, and issued reminders to affected partners in advance of the October deadline. He said the company worked hard to ensure partners understood the change was coming, but the developers who were locked out describe an entirely different reality. Yggdrasil says he received no email, saw no banner, and had zero notification of any kind before discovering in January that his account had been terminated. Donenfeld describes the same experience, no warning at all, just an access-restricted error when he went to do his job. Winscribe, a commercial VPN company that had held a verified and active Partner Center account for over 8 years, was also locked out and spent more than an entire month trying to resolve the situation through official channels before going public with their frustration. OSR, a company that has developed Windows drivers professionally for decades and represents some of the most experienced participants in the Windows hardware program, described yet another failure mode. Their administrators did see the banner in October, immediately completed the verification process, and confirmed their access was restored. Weeks later, preparing to push a critical update for their customers, some of whom work in critical infrastructure environments, they discovered their signing access had been revoked again, with no new notification and no explanation for why the verification they had already completed was no longer valid. When OSR pushed back on Davuluri's explanation that the communication process was thorough, they were direct. A blog post, they said, is not reasonable notice to companies whose customers depend on their ability to sign drivers. Like and subscribe, because this pattern of broken communication affected far more than just 2 well-known developers. The automated enforcement system that Microsoft deployed did not distinguish between abandoned accounts, fraudulent registrations, and projects that tens of millions of people depend on for their security infrastructure. VeraCrypt and WireGuard were processed by the same algorithm that would handle an inactive account that had not logged in for 3 years. There was no manual review. There was no elevated flag for widely used open source security tools. There was no human being asking the question, before we cut off this account, do we understand what software it signs and how many users would be affected? The algorithm ran, the threshold was not met, and the account was suspended. The millions of users on the other end of that decision were never part of the calculation. Windscribe's predicament exposed an additional layer of dysfunction in how Microsoft's Partner Center handles suspensions. Once an account is suspended, the system blocks the account holder from opening a support ticket. The only people who need urgent human support are the people whose accounts have been suspended, and those are the exact people the system locks out of the support channel. The feedback loop collapses completely at the precise moment it should function. Windscribe's public plea for anyone who knew a human being at Microsoft eventually reached the right person, but only because Epic Games CEO Tim Sweeney, in the middle of his own high-profile battles against platform monopolies, saw the post and amplified it to an audience that included Microsoft executives. Once the situation went viral and technology media started covering it in depth, Microsoft's response accelerated dramatically. Davulary posted on X, confirming the company had reached out to VeraCrypt and WireGuard. Microsoft VP Scott Hanselman characterized the suspension as an administrative paperwork issue rather than deliberate enforcement against those projects. He also emailed Yggdrasil directly to offer personal assistance in restoring the account. WireGuard's account was reinstated on April 9, 2026, just one day after the public wave of coverage peaked. For the millions of users of Mullvad, Proton VPN, Tailscale, and other WireGuard-dependent services, the immediate threat passed. Donenfeld was able to push a pending update, and the VPN ecosystem stabilized. VeraCrypt's situation did not resolve with the same speed. As the public spotlight began moving on, Yggdrasil's account remained suspended. Davulary's statement did not include a specific timeline for VeraCrypt's restoration, and Microsoft had not committed to a definitive date. Yggdrasil described the situation to TechCrunch in terms that left no room for interpretation. If the account is not restored in time to sign a new bootloader before the certificate authority expires, he said, it would be a death sentence for VeraCrypt on Windows. Not a setback, not a disruption. A death sentence. That word choice was deliberate, and it was accurate. The structural contradiction at the heart of this story is one that the privacy and security community has been quietly uncomfortable with for a long time. VeraCrypt exists to protect your data from unauthorized access, including, in principle, from an operating system vendor that might be legally compelled or technically positioned to access your files. The software is open source, which means the code is publicly auditable. Any researcher, security professional, or curious user can read every line and confirm that there is no backdoor, no hidden key, and no way for a third party to silently access what you have encrypted. The tool designed to protect your data from the operating system vendor cannot function without the explicit and ongoing permission of that very vendor. The moment that permission is revoked, even accidentally, even through a paperwork failure, even through an automated system that had no idea what it was terminating, the protection collapses. You're not actually in control of your encryption. You are renting permission to encrypt from the company that controls the platform. Like and subscribe, because that is not a philosophical abstraction. It is the precise mechanism that is threatening VeraCrypt users right now. For enterprise security teams, the implications go beyond one tool. Organizations that rely on VeraCrypt for compliance-mandated disk encryption now face a choice that should not exist in a healthy technology ecosystem. They can continue running software whose ability to function depends on a single developer's account status at a corporation that has already demonstrated it will suspend first and ask questions never. Or they can migrate to BitLocker, the full disk encryption tool built directly into Windows by Microsoft, which integrates seamlessly, receives guaranteed support, and will never be blocked by a Microsoft account suspension. BitLocker is also entirely proprietary. Its source code is not publicly auditable. Users must trust Microsoft's assurances about what it does and does not do. For organizations and individuals who chose VeraCrypt specifically because they wanted encryption that operated outside of any single vendor's control, migrating to BitLocker is not a neutral technical decision. It is a capitulation to the exact dependency they were encrypting to avoid. What this crisis ultimately exposes is a structural flaw in how Windows handles open source security infrastructure. The Windows hardware program was designed for commercial hardware vendors with legal departments, compliance teams, and dedicated staff to manage developer accounts. It was not designed with solo open source maintainers in mind. People like Yggdrasil, who maintains one of the world's most important security tools essentially by himself, handling everything from code to signing certificates to the support inbox. When the verification process broke down, there was no mechanism to recognize that the account being suspended was not an abandoned registration or a fraudulent submission, but the singular development account for a tool protecting the encrypted drives of millions of human beings. The fix that everyone is watching for is straightforward in principle, and apparently difficult in practice. Microsoft needs to restore Yggdrasil's account, and it needs to do so with enough time remaining before the July 2026 Certificate Authority revocation for him to sign a new VeraCrypt bootloader and push that update to users. Every day that passes without confirmed restoration the crisis is manageable. If it drags into late June, the situation becomes extremely tight. And if the account is not restored before the deadline, the consequences are not theoretical. They are millions of encrypted drives that will not boot, owned by people who did nothing wrong except trust that the tools protecting their data would continue to work. Idrasi has given VeraCrypt users clear instructions while the situation remains unresolved. If you have full disk encryption enabled with VeraCrypt on a Windows machine, open the application now, go to the System menu, and create a rescue disk. Store that rescue disk on a USB drive and keep it somewhere safe. Back up your volume. Headers. Do these things today, not next week. The rescue disk gives you a recovery pathway if the bootloader fails. It allows you to restore the original system loader temporarily and reach your data even if the VeraCrypt bootloader stops loading. It is not a perfect solution, but it is a lifeline, and having it ready before the deadline could be the difference between recovering your data and losing it permanently. The broader lesson embedded in this story is one that extends far beyond VeraCrypt and WireGuard. Every piece of software that runs at the kernel level on Windows is one account suspension away from the same crisis. VPN tools, endpoint protection software, authentication utilities, hardware drivers for specialized equipment, all of them depend on the same system, subject to the same automated enforcement, with the same absence of meaningful escalation pathways for legitimate developers. The 2022 malware signing incident that triggered this crackdown was real. Microsoft's response was understandable. But the implementation revealed that no one designing the re-verification enforcement process stopped to ask what happens when the algorithm catches something it should not have caught, and there is no human being empowered to override it. That gap between automated enforcement and human judgment is where this disaster was born. There is also a population of users in this story that rarely gets mentioned in the technology press. Journalists working in conflict zones in authoritarian countries use VeraCrypt to protect their sources. Human rights workers use it to protect documentation of abuses that governments want buried. Political dissidents use it to shield communications that, if exposed, could result in imprisonment or worse. For these users, encryption is not a preference or a technical hobby. It is a survival tool. The idea that a paperwork failure between a developer and a corporation could brick the encryption protecting a journalist's source list is not an edge case. It is a humanitarian risk embedded in the architecture of Windows kernel access, and no one designing the automated enforcement sweep appears to have thought about it. The wider fallout confirmed this was not a two-developer problem. LibreOffice, the open-source Office suite installed on hundreds of millions of computers worldwide, was also caught by the same enforcement sweep. Memtest x86, the memory testing. Utility that technicians have relied on for decades was locked out as well. Their inclusion made it impossible to dismiss the situation as targeted at specific developers. It was a systemic policy failure that indiscriminately hit legitimate, high-impact software with no mechanism to catch the error before the damage was done. What would a better system look like? The security community has several ideas that are now being discussed with renewed urgency. One proposal is a multi-signature approach to driver verification, where high-profile open-source projects could be endorsed by a community-governed certificate authority that Microsoft recognizes as a trusted entity alongside its own. This would break the single point of failure dependency on one individual's account status. Another proposal is a tiered human review process for account suspensions affecting software with significant user counts, so that no automated system can terminate an account tied to millions of active installations without a human being reviewing the case first. A third idea is a mandatory grace period before suspensions take effect, with guaranteed human escalation pathways available during that window, so that developers have a real opportunity to resolve compliance issues before being cut off entirely. None of these are radical suggestions. They are basic safeguards that any well-designed enforcement system should already include. The resolution of this situation will set a precedent that shapes how open-source developers think about building security tools for Windows for years to come. If Microsoft restores Idrasi's account in time and commits to clear policy changes about how high-impact open-source projects are handled in future enforcement sweeps, the damage is containable. If the account is not restored before the July deadline and millions of encrypted drives become unbootable, the harm runs deeper than lost data. It erodes the credibility of building privacy software on Windows entirely. Like and subscribe, because the answer to that question is being written right now by what Microsoft chooses to do in the weeks ahead. If you are running VeraCrypt on Windows, make your rescue disk today, back up your encryption headers, do not wait. And if this story changed how you think about who actually controls the tools protecting your data, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because on Windows, the right to run security software at the kernel level is a permission, not a guarantee. And right now, that permission is suspended for the one developer keeping millions of encrypted drives alive.